When people talk about overpowered nations in War Thunder, they usually only talk about three: America, Germany, and Russia. They're commonly referred to as the Big Three, and for good reason. When compared to other tech trees, these nations receive an overwhelming number of vehicles, usually leading to an imbalance in gameplay. There are a few root causes for this issue. For one, they attract the most players. Two, these nations have historically had large militaries, meaning they have a larger pool of potential vehicle additions. And three, in my experience, people that play these nations are more likely to spend money on their vehicles, giving Gaijin even more incentive to add more vehicles for them. While Gaijin is happy to add minor nations to the game, their post-launch support isn't the greatest. China and Sweden still don't have helicopter tech trees. 3 out of the 6 minor nations still don't have any naval units. China doesn't have a tank above 9.7, and will only be getting a 10.0 tank in the next update. And Japan doesn't have a 10.7 MBT, but that's just scratching the surface. That isn't accounting for all the smaller gaps that exist within these trees. The obvious solution is to add more vehicles for these nations, though as I said earlier, some nations will find it difficult to truly flesh out their tech trees, especially as the tech tree becomes more modern. These days, nations having an indigenous main battle tank isn't common. They usually just buy an export model with someone else's. So this video will not only be explaining where gaps exist, and what vehicles could be added under Gaijin's system, but also how that system can be expanded to allow minor nations to be more competitive. I'm gonna try and go about this in a way that keeps gameplay interesting, aka, teams aren't all homogenous and essentially using the same vehicles. The first and easiest solution is something that is already done to some extent, and that is to roll nations with geopolitical ties into a unified tech tree. For example, instead of having a Swedish tech tree, it could be a Scandinavian tech tree. The Scandinavian tech tree is a popular idea, but it can go further than that. Italy, for example, has very close relations with Israel. Israeli tanks could be rolled into the Italian tech tree at higher tiers, giving them more MBT options. At lower tiers for Italy, minor Axis nations like Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia could fill gaps and replace some of the more common Lend-Lease vehicles they received this year, like the Sherman. This would add more variety to the game, give Italian players more tanks to play, and would give these minor nations some representation. When it comes to China, they could receive North Korean tanks to supplement their upper mid tiers. It wouldn't give them a ton of options, but it couldn't hurt. France has a lot of their own stuff that has yet to be added, though they could use Swiss vehicles to flesh out their lineup. Besides being located next to each other, France and Switzerland have been somewhat close to each other politically. MOAG vehicles like the Typhon, Trojan, and Piranha would help to spice things up a bit, though there are a lot more options beyond those. Britain already uses a variety of Commonwealth vehicles, so they likely could continue using those to fill gaps, though that could be a slippery slope. Japan is in a much more difficult position. Some people have called for South Korea to be rolled into the Japanese tech tree. This does make a bit of sense, as they're currently military allies, though if you know even a bit about their history, you know that Korea and Japan have never really gotten along. There is a lot of tension that still exists between the two, so people from both nations might be upset that their vehicles are associated with the other. Though Gaijin also put two nations together when one doesn't even recognize the other as legitimate, so you know, it's not much of a stretch. Combining South Korea and Japan would open up a lot more options for MBTs, IFVs, and other support vehicles, all of which Japan is in desperate need of. To finally give Japan a decent surface-to-air missile platform, they could get the K-SAM Chunma, which essentially fires VT-1 missiles. The K-21, essentially a CV-90, could be their top-tier IFV after the Type 89. Instead of just Type 90 prototypes, which would be incredibly similar, the K-1 and K-1A1 could be used to flesh out Japan's MBT lineup. Gaijin could also make regimental vehicles that are researchable, sort of like the premium Chihei. They could do that, or they could incorporate them into events. It would be like a vehicle backup, except you don't have to pay for it, just research and spade it. Or if you went with the latter option, take part in an event. This is sort of already done with the Type 90B, but not all nations have tanks with extremely slight variations like that. As long as these vehicles were foldered, I can't really see people having an issue with it. But you never know. There is another way to give players more tanks to spawn in a match, even if their tech tree is small, but it may be controversial. I was thinking that, if you have a large amount of spawn points, and you have that particular tank researched, you could spawn in a tank from another nation, as long as that nation is also on your team. Not like you could make a mixed lineup yourself, but the game will say, okay, the game is in this BR range, the player has this tank researched from this nation, so add it to the list of spawnable vehicles. This would retain the composition of teams, while also keeping more players in the game for longer. In fact, there would be much more incentive to stay in the match, so you could get a lot of points and research 2 tech trees at once. I know this is a pretty drastic change, so it'd be difficult to do, and a lot of people might not like it, but I think it could be interesting. I'd like to hear what you guys think about it. I know I didn't get super specific with vehicles, mostly because it would take too long to go more in depth about the vehicle's performance and possible placement, and there are people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am on possible additions for minor tech trees. Regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.
You